This first offseason together is really going to set the power dynamic between Ben Johnson and Ryan Poles, and we'll get to see just how much say the new head coach has in roster decisions.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lauren Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast at Locked On Bears on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and the Locked On Bears YouTube channel, where you can keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. On the show today, I want to dive into what's really at stake this offseason. Bigger picture, what this 2025 offseason means for Ryan Poles, for Ben Johnson, and for the Chicago Bears. Last year, we talked about how the last offseason was really going to define Ryan Poles' long-term tenure because of the quarterback decision that he had to make between Justin Fields and Caleb Williams and all that stuff. That's ultimately going to be what sets Ryan Poles up for success or failure in the long run. But this offseason, the first one with Ben Johnson, will take us behind the curtains a little bit on what the dynamic's going to be like between those two guys. There were some thoughts that Ben Johnson might want his own general manager, depending on where he was going to be hired. The Bears have told us all along that Ryan Poles is in charge and that those two are going to have a great relationship, et cetera, but their contracts aren't yet on the exact same timeline here. And there can be this tension between, okay, how Ben Johnson sees the roster going and how Ryan Poles sees this roster going. And the moves they make this offseason will help give us a better idea of how those visions look and how aligned those may or may not be. So we'll kind of go through the different signs along the way and the different dynamics that are going to be at play this offseason to kind of get a sense of how that relationship between those two guys will continue to go moving forward here. Because I'd like to think about this in terms of Ryan Poles has final say over this Bears roster, right? He had final say over the head coaching decision. He gets to make the football decisions. When push comes to shove, if there's a disagreement, Ryan Poles is ultimately Ben Johnson's boss and in charge of this organization and its football operations in that regard. So it's Ryan Poles' team first. But the Bears also gave Ben Johnson a massive contract worth a lot of money, more than they pay any other head coach, I think, in Chicago Bears history, certainly more than any other first-time head coach in Chicago Bears history. And given that Ben Johnson gets this nice long-term contract, and Ryan Poles is still on the tail end of his initial contract. There have been talks of a contract extension, but nothing happening that we know of yet. There's just some interesting lingering dynamics here. And so I'm curious to see when it comes to free agent decisions, and the NFL draft as well, but especially in free agency, how much we see this offseason being shaped by Ben Johnson and the coaching staff getting their guys that they know from previous experience and the guys that they really want versus Ryan Poles leaning on the scouting department and his evaluations and getting other outside players who might not have the same connections to the coaching staff, but the front office believes may be, the best options for this Chicago Bears team. Because we've seen in the previous coaching staff, Ryan Poles was very cooperative and forthcoming with getting the coaching staff their guys. And you can say it was for better and for worse, and perhaps a little bit more for worse. Like if you think back to when the Bears first brought in Matt Eberflus, that initial coaching staff in 2022, with Luke Getsy as the offensive coordinator, the Bears go out and they get Luke Getsy's center from the Green Bay Packers, Lucas Patrick, in free agency. They bring in one of Luke Getsy's wide receivers, Equanimeous St. Brown, from the Green Bay Packers. They later go on to bring in Luke Getsy's tight end, Robert Tonyan, right? We saw Ryan Poles and this Bears team be deliberate in saying, all right, let's get you, the coaching staff, some familiar names and faces that you've worked with in the past, that you can vouch for, that we can trust, that you know them and what they're capable of in your offense, and we can help you be more comfortable and help ease that transition. That idea sounds great on paper, and perhaps when it's a high-quality coach, that does work well, but I mean, the three names I just mentioned there for Luke Getsy didn't particularly pan out, but Ryan Poles still, gives that grace to the next offensive coordinator. Shane Waldron comes in the offseason, right? And they go to free agency that year, and they bring in Gerald Everett, the tight end, who had worked with Waldron before with the Los Angeles Rams. The center, Coleman Shelton, had worked with Waldron before on the Rams. The running back, Travis Homer, comes back with their Seattle Seahawks connections. Like, they go out and get some guys that Shane Waldron knew and Shane Waldron wanted it to be for his team. So, all right, we're going to try and set you up and put you in a good position to succeed. And none of those three free agent signings really worked out very well either. Shelton played all season, but was a little bit underwhelming. He's probably the best out of any of the six players we just talked about there. And then you can point to Matt Eberflus not necessarily getting guys directly from the Indianapolis Colts, but Ryan Poles going out right away and making it a priority to get Tremaine Edmonds and TJ Edwards, big linebacker investment for Eberflus. But the defense was already building up in that way, but trading for Montez Sweat as well, like getting some guys for the defense, even if they weren't directly Matt Eberflus guys there. So then this time around, second coaching staff for Ryan Poles, seat a little bit hotter, job on the line with this coaching staff. Does he again say, hey, Ben Johnson, hey, Dennis Allen, let's go get your guys. Let's make sure that we bring in players you're familiar with. We did a whole podcast about this, yesterday's podcast, looking at free agents entering this offseason that have connections to Ben Johnson's coaching staff, whether it's the Lions with Ben Johnson or the Saints with Dennis Allen or the Chiefs with Eric Bieniemy or the Jaguars with Press Taylor. And it's a bunch of different connections this Bears coaching staff has to upcoming free agents. Do they go out and get Ben Johnson's offensive lineman or Ben Johnson's wide receiver to help bolster that side of the ball? Do they go out and get Saints defensive linemen to help with Dennis Allen? Or does Ryan Poles look at this and say, listen, we tried the friends and family thing of like, go get players you already knew, and that wasn't working out very well for us. So let's just go get who our scouts determine are the best possible free agents, even if our coaches don't know them as well. That's the dynamic we're going to need to keep an eye on. Of course, not every free agent you sign are going to be guys your coaching staff knows. You just can't fill your whole free agency period like that. But that ratio, right? Do they go out and get a bunch of familiar guys, or do they not really get Ben Johnson's old players and Dennis Allen's old players and just go out and sign players they feel like are the best? Like, it's that, I don't want to call it tension because it's not a tension yet, but it's that dynamic between, do you trust the coaches or do you trust the scouts? And when those align, that's great, but they're not always going to align. And where the Bears decide to go there will tell us a lot about how much sway Ben Johnson may have, how much trust Ryan Poles may have then in Ben Johnson to say, we're going to get you your guys because we believe in you and your ability to evaluate these players. Or do you say, you know what, you do the coaching, we'll do the player evaluation. We're going to give you good players and you do your job to make them even better, but we're going to identify good players on our own and not need your evaluation or your familiarity with those guys to be ultimately the determining factor. Because at the end of the day, Ryan Poles' job is to give Ben Johnson the necessary talent to be successful and to run Ben Johnson's offense and to be the coach they need him to be. And there's no benefit of the doubt there, and there's no more waiting and being patient with it. Like, this needs to happen now, and Ryan Poles needs to give him everything he needs. And that's going to be part of this power dynamic of Ben Johnson being the great coach, but Ryan Poles needing to empower him. And so we'll kind of look at what that might look like and how that balance goes this offseason next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, America's #1 sportsbook. You know, when the game tips off, that's just getting started in the NBA action. There's no better place to get in on it than FanDuel, because with FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game. So if you miss the opening tip-off or you want to bet on a fourth quarter comeback, you can stay in on the action. And if you're looking for an even bigger payout, you can combine your live bets into a same-game parlay. So once we come out of this All-Star break and you want to jump back in on the NBA action, FanDuel is a great way to keep every moment of the game exciting. You can also bet on college basketball, hockey, tennis, soccer, combat sports, boxing, WNBA as well, all in the FanDuel Sportsbook app that's super easy to use. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, official sports betting partner of the NBA. Ben Johnson can only succeed in Chicago if Ryan Poles gives him an adequate level of talent for Ben Johnson to be able to execute his offense to the fullest. Now, it's a two-way street because Ben Johnson needs to be able to take talent that Ryan Poles provides him and get more out of it. And I find one of the signs of a great coach is someone who makes players better than they were previously, and maybe a player who you didn't regard as highly ends up rising to an even higher level. So it's not as though Ben Johnson needs 22 Pro Bowlers to be successful with the Chicago Bears, but you can't necessarily give him, say, the offensive line the Bears had last year and expect Ben Johnson to be able to craft a top 5 offense out of that group. Like, in theory, if Ben Johnson is the great coach that we think he can be, he could take that Bears offense from last year and be better than it was with the coaching the Bears did have, right? But this sort of back and forth dynamic of Ben Johnson needing Ryan Poles to give him what he needs, and then Ryan Poles needing Ben Johnson to get more out of what he has, is going to be a really important part of this power dynamic. Because obviously, Ryan Poles needs to fix the Chicago Bears offensive line. Ben Johnson doesn't need to fix the Chicago Bears offensive line. Ben Johnson may need to, clean up some of Caleb Williams' footwork, for example, or his processing and his reading of coverages. Ben Johnson may need to, tweak Rome Odunze's route running or call plays that better fit DeAndre Swift's style of running, right? Like, those are things Ben Johnson can control. Here is talented player, put talented player in best position to be successful. But Ben Johnson can't scheme his way to a better offensive line. Ben Johnson can't call a certain set of plays that will make Coleman Shelton and Matt Pryor great offensive linemen. Like, you can only, you can squeeze more out of guys, but you can only do so much. There has to be a level of talent at a baseline there for the coaching staff to be able to work with. And Ben Johnson needs to be able to trust that from Ryan Poles and needs to get that from Ryan Poles, or else what you don't want is him left looking around saying, like, listen, I'm a great coach. I can scheme up all this stuff, but I need better talent. Like, Ryan Poles, up to this point as Bears general manager, has not been able to rebuild and fix this Bears offensive line. He has not been able to field a talented, quality offensive line from left to right. I think on the get-go, as is true everywhere on the roster, there was a willingness to be patient. He inherited a team. He did a lot of tearing down of that team. And so, you can't necessarily blame him when he comes in year one and he's got Larry Borum as a starting offensive tackle, because there's just only so much you can do. And that's kind of what was here already, when he took over this position, but you can blame Ryan Poles when his solution at the center position was Lucas Patrick and have him rotating with Sam Mustipher and not hitting on the moves he did make, right? Like, I think right away it's like he can't do everything all at once, so it's hard to kill him for the stuff he didn't do initially, but you can criticize him for the moves he did make initially and some of the misses he has had on this offensive line, right? 2024 felt like the first offseason where you could say, hey, you should have done more. There was room to do more. You had cap space to do more, and you under invested in the offensive line. The first couple of years, it's like you're trying to do a lot of stuff all at once, and I get it. It's hard to do everything. But it's also hard to trust that, the free agent signings he's made up front, right? Like Nate Davis being a big splash for them there. A huge bust, obviously. Lucas Patrick also was supposed to be a real solution for that group. doesn't really get the job done. Coleman Shelton underwhelms. The trade for Ryan Bates is mostly an injury that keeps us from really knowing if there's anything good there or not. Like, we just haven't seen outside of honestly, the NFL draft, he's done decently with Darnell Wright as a first-round pick, Braxton Jones as a fifth-round pick. Those are both good picks for him. Karana Magaji, too early to tell. But, right, there's just not this track record of like, oh, yeah, Ryan Poles has got this. The offensive line has been his biggest Achilles heel in properly building this Chicago Bears roster, and it's going to be the most critical position for Ben Johnson to be able to succeed. In part because I think Poles has done a good job building everything else, right? You've got wide receivers, you've got a tight end, you've got a couple running backs, you've got the quarterback. Like, the offensive line is a bigger hole because of the good things he's been able to do at other positions. But like, now there's no excuse. Now there's no time to wait and time to dilly-dally here. Like, you've got clear and obvious holes: left guard, center, right guard. I don't mean to beat the dead horse here, but like, Ryan Bates and Jordan McFadden are your only interior offensive linemen under contract, right? It's not like you can come in and say, well, you know, we still have Tevin Jenkins under contract. We still have this player under contract, so we're going to keep them around and try and do a competition. Like, this is as blank of a slate for fixing at least the interior of the Chicago Bears offensive line as we've seen in Ryan Poles' years here, right? There's not that big lingering contract. First, you know, Cody Whitehair was the big expensive contract that maybe was keeping you from spending more there. And then Nate Davis became the big expensive contract where it's like, well, we're already paying so much to him. How much can we keep paying there? Like, all of that stuff starts to go out the window. And now, because none of these guys are under contract, like, it is forcing Ryan Poles to have to do more on the offensive line. And whether it was something that was going to be a high priority for Ben Johnson or not, like, this is going to be the case. And so it will be the ultimate judge of Ryan Poles' ability to evaluate and address that position properly with free agents and the NFL draft, and the combination of those two things, right? There's no more this sort of like piecemeal thing. Well, we'll change the right guard this offseason and then get a new center next offseason and, you know, try and keep finding, you know, one little piece at a time. Like, this has to be an overhaul down to the studs, at least on the interior there. And so we'll find out. There's no more woulda, coulda, shoulda competition here. Like, it's going to be all or nothing. Fix this offensive line or it's not. And if Ryan Poles, you know, misses on a free agent again, you sign somebody with big money and then he's hurt by week one, like, that's adding to a consistent failure there. And does that change some of the dynamic there between Ben Johnson and Ryan Poles, where it's like, you give Ben Johnson this big contract and Ben Johnson saying, hey, I'm trying to fulfill my potential and show you why I'm the right head coaching hiring, but the talent the general manager is giving me isn't getting the job done and is holding me back from being the best head coach he can be. And then you start to say, well, depending on when Ryan Poles and Ben Johnson do or do not get aligned on that same timeline, like, all of a sudden it feels to me like there is a ton of pressure on Ryan Poles and not nearly as much pressure on Ben Johnson. And I want to look at what that pressure looks like and sort of how the timelines and the time frames of that pressure pan out next on Locked On Bears. When the Bears hired Ben Johnson, there was reporting soon after that the Bears were going to work on a contract extension for Ryan Poles to then get he and Ben Johnson aligned on a similar timeline. I think the understanding is that Ryan Poles' contract is up in 2026 and that Ben Johnson just got I think a 5-year deal paying him about $13 million a year. And if you were to let it linger like that, you could have a lame duck type of situation for a general manager, and that doesn't feel like organizational alignment between a head coach and a general manager that Ben Johnson expressed as being an important part of this process. But the longer you go without those guys being aligned, the more room you leave for question marks or doubts or speculation or whatever it might end up being for this group. And so, well, I think everything is great now, right? Ryan Poles, Ben Johnson starting on the same foot, everything's going. I'm not trying to like create some rift between them that does not exist at this point. I just like to think in the long term here, because Ryan Poles has benefited really through almost the entire Eberflus era up until this year at least. Like, this was always a long-term play for Ryan Poles and Matt Eberflus to some extent. Like, this was always going to be, hey, this is a 2, 3, 4 year process here. So Ryan Poles could take his time, in 2022 when he first comes in, right? He can let players go. He can trade away Robert Quinn. He can trade away Roquan Smith. He can tear down this roster a little bit and not have as strong of a sense of urgency to like get this figured out, right? It was about building it the right way, hitting on draft picks, building up young players and developing that talent. And a big part of developing that talent was supposed to be the coaching staff developing that talent, right? But like even going into year 2, right? Like they're still trying to piece together. They signed Yannick Ngakoue and DeMarcus Walker and trying to figure out what this team was going to be. But it wasn't like year 2 was even like, all right, all in, going to win the Super Bowl, right? It's just like, take some little steps forward. Keep working away at your roster. Like, take your time, build us a beautiful masterpiece or whatever. But now we're in year 4 of Ryan Poles, and it's go time. Like, there's no more excuses of like, well, it takes time to build a roster. There's no more, well, we got to tear things down and then build back up. Like, okay, maybe you can say, hey, we got a bunch of Matt Eberflus guys, and it's going to take a little bit of time to get Ben Johnson's guys. But at the same time, this roster was already supposed to be ready to win in 2024. This was supposed to be a team that Caleb Williams comes into and maybe takes them to the playoffs, or at least takes them farther than they had gone the year before. And that all imploded, and the mid-season firing of Shane Waldron and then Matt Eberflus, right, was very strong messaging from the team saying, hey, the problem is coaching. The problem is not roster. The problem is coaching. Or maybe the problem is mostly coaching, right? It's not black and white and say it's 0% roster, 100% coaching, but like clearly the message sent was like, hey, we think the roster is better than the results we're getting, and that means it's the coaches that are failing the roster. So now you've got new coaches. You've got presumably, hopefully, better coaches. So if the roster was good and the coaches were the problem, then you don't need to change the roster much, right? Yeah, sure. There's some free agents that you're going to let go, and there's going to be some turnover, and there might be a couple salary cap casualties, and maybe some guys that aren't, exactly what Dennis Allen might want in his defense or what Ben Johnson might want in his offense. But this is not a thing where you're going to replace 11 starters to get Ben Johnson's guys in here, right? DJ Moore's not going anywhere. Rome Odunze's not going anywhere. Darnell Wright's not going anywhere. Cole Kmet's not going anywhere. Caleb Williams not going anywhere. The pieces that are there are in it for the long haul. You're not turning over this offense to get Ben Johnson's guys here. Same thing for parts of this defense, right? Like Montez Sweat, Jervon Dexter, Jalen Johnson, Kyler Gordon. Like these players, like key foundational cornerstone pieces across both sides of the ball are locked in and are set and are who the Bears have hitched their wagon to, either financially or otherwise, in how they've invested in them with draft capital and whatnot. So there's no like, oh, well, Ben Johnson needs time to get his guys. Dennis Allen needs time to get his guys. Like, nope. You can get some of your guys this offseason, and that has to be enough. Right? You have talent on this roster, and even if they're not perfectly aligned with exactly what you might ideally want at that position, there's some good players here. And so if you're a good coach, you can make it work, and you can be successful with those players. And so from Ryan Poles' perspective, there's not much time to sit around and say, oh, well, we can't fill all the holes at once in the offseason, and there's still a lot to do. There shouldn't be a lot to do. The whole message last offseason was, hey, there's not much left to do. Let's take this and ride. Like, obviously, there are holes to fill because of free agents. We talk interior offensive line, right? Number 2 tight end, number 3 wide receiver, some more pass rush. But these are not necessarily like lingering big holes that, hey, we're still getting through this team building process. Like, you should be able to address all of the holes on this roster this offseason. There's no more, there's too much to do. You can't do it all at one time. I've been very willing to give Ryan Poles that patience and that benefit of the doubt and say, yeah, you can't rebuild a whole offensive line in one offseason, or you can't rebuild a whole defense in one offseason. But the Bears are not at the point where they need to rebuild a whole anything. Maybe, okay, interior of the offensive line, but it's like there's a handful of spots the Bears need to address, and they have the cap space and the draft picks to address them right now. Not address them in the long term and like, okay, it'll be good in a year or two now. Like, no, you're not going through this offseason saying, well, all we could do is put a rookie there, so you have to give us patience for that player to get better. Like, nope, you can sign everything you need in free agency. You can augment that in the NFL draft. Like, you can do it all this offseason. There's no waiting and there's no excuses. And so that's how Ben Johnson should expect this roster to come together. This team, it's not that this team is going to be a Super Bowl contender in year one, or that this team is going to be at its peak in year one, because you still have young players developing, right? But the question marks shouldn't be there anymore after this offseason. The only question mark should be, how much better does young player X get this year? It's not, will this player be any good? But it's like, okay, how much of a leap forward does Caleb Williams make? How much better is Roma Dunze? How much better is Darnell Wright? Does Tyreek Stevenson get better? Does Jaquan, like those question marks, it's like question marks of players who are already here. And they just need to be coached up and developed. And that's part of like the young player question, right? Kind of like we think about the Green Bay Packers being a young team. The talent's there. It's just a matter of how they develop and how quickly they rise into bigger roles as they get experience. But we shouldn't have a question mark of like, who's going to be your starting right guard? We'll see how the competition plays out. There's no excuse for that. Who's going to be your starting defensive end opposite Montez Sweat? Who's going to win the competition? Settle these questions now so that the only thing you have to do is coach them up and develop them. Like that's what you hired Ben Johnson and Dennis Allen for, is to take the talent you provide them and coach them up. And so that's where the real core of like the dynamic between Poles and Johnson and what's at stake this offseason. Ben Johnson needs Ryan Poles to give him everything he needs. There's no excuse for Ryan Poles to not give Ben Johnson everything he needs this offseason. And then as a result, if Ryan Poles gives Ben Johnson everything he needs, then there's no excuse for Ben Johnson and this coaching staff to not make this Chicago Bears team significantly better. I think I want to be careful putting a specific win expectation on that, because it is going to be transition and it is going to be some young players, and it is going to take time for just everyone to learn the new systems and the new coaches and all that stuff. Like, I don't think it needs to be winning the NFC North and making the NFC Championship game and winning 13 games in year one. Like, that doesn't need to be where the bar is, but there needs to be a clear, visible improvement, both in terms of the results, but also just the culture and the vibes and everything around the team needs to be significantly and noticeably better. There's no like, oh, well, it's going to take time for Ben Johnson to instill his offense and for Dennis Allen's defense to really get installed. Like, no, you have talented players and you're supposed to be talented coaches. Like, if Ryan Poles gives Ben Johnson everything he needs, then there's no excuse for Ben Johnson. And if Ben Johnson is as good of a coach as we think he can be, then there should be no excuse for Ryan Poles. Like, he should be able to give everything they need, should be able to happen this year. The excuse time is running out, and the time for patience, at least in terms of the team building, is running out. You got to cook now. The pressure is on Ryan Poles to like get this done for Ben Johnson, or else risk not being on the same timeline as his head coach and getting through the cycle all over again of people not being aligned, quarterback, coach, GM not always being aligned in Chicago. I don't think Ryan Poles' job is severely in jeopardy. I think they will give Ryan Poles a contract extension. He and Ben Johnson will be tied for multiple years, so it's not like Ryan Poles' offseason is like trying to save his job with free agency in the draft. That being said, if you want to save your job in the long run, it starts now, and it's go time, and this Bears team needs to take that next step right away and be better and show that real progress in a variety of forms beyond just what the win-loss total looks like. So that to me is what's really at stake this offseason and why this offseason is so important and matters a ton. We're going to break down all of those free agent signings, draft picks, if they make any trades, you name it. We've got all of your Bears offseason topics covered right here on the Locked On Bears podcast. So make sure you hit the subscribe button on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts, because that's going to be the best way to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. If you're looking for a second listen, check out the Locked On NFL podcast, where we cover the league as a whole. I co-host every Tuesday morning with Tyler Rowland on Locked On NFL. We talked about the Chicago Bears and the NFC North, previewing the offseason ahead for each of the 4 NFC North teams, as well as the top candidates for the franchise tag, now that the franchise tag window opens up today as the podcast comes out. So go check out Locked On NFL to make your second listen of the day. Coming back tomorrow, make Locked On Bears your first listen once again for another opportunity to bear down.